The annals of Russian history hold one of its most mysterious secrets: the disappearance of the original Manifesto on the freedom of the nobility. This document, signed by Emperor Peter III on February 18, 1762, forever changed the fate of the Russian nobility, freeing it from compulsory state service. But where is the original copy of this historic document? For more than 2 centuries, historians, archivists, and researchers around the world have been trying to unravel the mystery of its disappearance. Palace coups, revolutions, wars, secret archives. This story is full of intrigue and mystery that still haunts scholars to this day. February 18, 1762 was a turning point in the history of the Russian Empire. On this day, Emperor Peter III signed a document that forever changed the life of the Russian nobility. The Manifesto on the freedom of the nobility freed members of the upper class from compulsory government service, which had been their main duty to the throne for decades. But today, more than 2.5 centuries later, this historical document has become the center of one of the most mysterious secrets in Russian history. The original Manifesto has disappeared without a trace. Where is it? Was it destroyed, or is it still kept in someone's private collection? These questions preoccupy historians and archivists around the world. The story of the Manifesto's disappearance begins in an era of palace coups, when the Russian Empire was experiencing a period of political instability. Peter III, grandson of Peter the Great, ruled for only 186 days, but during that short time, he managed to carry out reforms whose consequences were felt for centuries. The Manifesto was not just an administrative document, it was a revolution in the social structure of the empire. Before its publication, nobles were required to serve the state for life, starting from childhood. Peter I established this system to create a professional army and an effective state apparatus. But by the middle of the 18th century, the situation had changed. By that time, the nobility had become an educated and cultured class. Many nobles received a European education, spoke foreign languages, and were interested in science and the arts. Compulsory service was increasingly seen as an anachronism that hindered the development of the individual and society. The idea of freeing the nobility from compulsory service was already in the air during the reign of Elizabeth Petrovna. The Empress promised several times to consider the issue, but never decided on radical changes. Peter III proved to be more decisive. The Manifesto was prepared in the strictest secrecy. The Emperor understood that such a reform could provoke resistance in certain circles. After all, freeing the nobility from service could weaken the state apparatus, especially the army. But Peter III was convinced that his decision was right. Work on the text of the Manifesto was led by Dmitry Vasilyevich Volkov, one of the emperor's most trusted advisors. Volkov was an experienced diplomat and lawyer who understood the subtleties of the wording of state documents. He brought in the best legal experts of the time to work on the text. The text of the Manifesto was carefully checked. Every word was important. The document had to clearly define the rights and obligations of the emancipated nobility without creating legal conflicts. Particular attention was paid to the military aspects of the reform. The Manifesto established that nobles could freely leave the service, except in times of war. Those who chose a civilian career had to serve for at least 12 years. The document also guaranteed nobles the right to travel abroad for education and even to enter foreign service. The signing of the Manifesto was a solemn ceremony. The emperor used special ink and a seal. The document was written on the finest paper with watermarks. Every detail emphasized the historical significance of the moment. But just a few months later, the fate of Peter III himself changed tragically. On June 28, 1762, a palace coup took place. Catherine II overthrew her husband and became empress. Peter III soon died under mysterious circumstances. The new empress was faced with a difficult choice: Repealing the manifesto would have caused discontent among the nobility, but full recognition of it could have been seen as legitimizing the rule of her deposed husband. Catherine II chose a compromise, confirming the main provisions of the manifesto, but making her own amendments. It was from this moment that the tangled history of the original document began. In the chaos of the palace coup, many documents were moved, hidden, or destroyed. The original manifesto on the freedom of the nobility was among them. Peter III was one of the most controversial figures in Russian history. Charles Peter Ulrich of Holstein-Gottorp was born on February 10, 1728, in the city of Kiel. He was the grandson of Peter the Great on his mother's side and the nephew of Swedish King Charles XII on his father's side. This dual heritage largely determined his character and political views. The future emperor spent his childhood in Holstein, influenced by German culture and the Protestant faith. He received a typical European education of the time, studying languages, history, and military affairs. He had a particular passion for military games and drill, which later manifested itself in his reformist activities. In 1742, at the age of 14, Charles Peter was brought to Russia by his aunt, Empress Elizabeth Petrovna. She declared him heir to the throne and gave him the name Peter Fyodorovich. The German prince's difficult adaptation to Russian realities began. The adaptation was not easy. The young heir spoke Russian poorly, had difficulty mastering Orthodox rituals, and openly expressed his admiration for the Prussian military system. This caused discontent at court, where many saw him as a stranger, incapable of understanding the Russian soul. But it was precisely Peter III's Europeanism that allowed him to take a fresh look at Russian problems. He saw how life was organized in European countries, where the nobility was not bound by state service. The French philosophers of the Enlightenment, whom he read, argued that coercion was contrary to natural human rights. A military career was central to the future emperor's life. He thoroughly studied the Prussian military system and admired the discipline and organization of Frederick the Great's army. This fascination seemed excessive to many at court, especially considering that Russia was at war with Prussia at the time as part of the 7 Years' War. His relationship with Catherine, the future empress, was complicated. The marriage was a political alliance initiated by Elizabeth Petrovna. The spouses had different characters, interests, and views on the future of Russia. Catherine was more flexible in political matters, while Peter often acted in a straightforward and categorical manner. The accession to the throne on January 5, 1762, marked the beginning of Peter III's active reformist activity. During his 186 days in power, he issued numerous decrees, many of which were liberal in nature. The abolition of the secret chancellery, the permission for political prisoners to return from exile, and religious tolerance all characterized him as a progressive ruler. The Manifesto on the Freedom of the Nobility was the culmination of his liberal reforms. Peter III believed that compulsory service turned the nobility into slaves of the state, which contradicted their high social status. He wanted to create a truly free class in Russia, capable of creative development. The manifesto was prepared with the help of the best lawyers of the time. The emperor personally participated in the discussion of each point. He insisted that the document be not only legally flawless, but also reflect the philosophical principles of the Enlightenment. Peter III paid particular attention to the wording concerning military service. He understood that completely freeing the nobility from military duty could weaken the army. Therefore, the manifesto stipulated that in wartime, nobles could not leave the service without permission. The emperor also included provisions on the right of the nobility to travel abroad. This was a revolutionary innovation for Russia, where travel abroad was traditionally strictly controlled. Peter III believed that familiarity with European culture would benefit the Russian nobility. The reaction to the manifesto was mixed. The nobility welcomed it with enthusiasm, At last they had gained their long-awaited freedom, but in military and bureaucratic circles, the document caused concern. Many feared that a mass exodus of nobles from service would paralyze the state apparatus. Peter III did not live to see the long-term consequences of his reform. A palace coup interrupted his reign, and the emperor himself died under mysterious circumstances. But the Manifesto on the Freedom of the Nobility outlived its creator and became one of the most important documents in Russian history. Paradoxically, it was the nobles whom Peter III had freed from compulsory service who played a key role in his overthrow. Many of them supported Catherine II, seeing her as a more suitable candidate for the throne. This shows the complexity of the political processes of that time. The personality of Peter III remains a mystery to historians. Was he a progressive reformer ahead of his time, or an impractical dreamer who did not understand Russian realities? The truth probably lies somewhere in between. But his contribution to Russian history through the Manifesto on the Freedom of the Nobility is undeniable. The tragic fate of the reformist emperor adds drama to the story of the disappearance of the original Manifesto. The document, which was supposed to become a monument to his liberal ideas, was lost in the turmoil of political change. To this day, historians are still trying to unravel the mystery of its disappearance. The Manifesto on the Freedom of the Nobility was a turning point in the history of Russian society. The document radically changed the legal status of the empire's highest class and laid the foundations for the formation of a new type of social relations. To understand the scale of these changes, it is necessary to return to the system that existed before February 18, 1762. Compulsory service for the nobility was introduced by Peter I as part of his comprehensive reforms. The great reformer sought to create an efficient European-style state, which required a professional administrative apparatus and a modern army. The nobility was to become the backbone of this system. The table of ranks, introduced in 1722, clearly regulated the service hierarchy. Every nobleman had to start his career at the lowest ranks and advance through the service, depending on his abilities and diligence. It was a meritocratic system where personal merit played a greater role than birth. The compulsory service system had its positive aspects. It contributed to the modernization of the country, the creation of a professional bureaucracy, and the strengthening of the empire's military power. Many nobles received a quality education, studied foreign languages, and became acquainted with European culture. But by the middle of the 18th century, this system began to show its shortcomings. The compulsory nature of service reduced the motivation of the nobility. Many served formally, without showing initiative or creativity. The state got executors, but not enthusiasts. By that time, the nobility had evolved considerably. While many nobles during the reign of Peter I were illiterate provincial landowners, their descendants received a European education, read French philosophers, and were interested in art and science. For such people, lifelong compulsory service seemed anachronistic. The economic aspect also played an important role. Many nobles owned large estates that required personal presence and management. Constant service in the capital or in military posts prevented them from effectively managing their estates. This had a negative impact on both the income of the nobles themselves and the overall state of the economy. Peter III's Manifesto radically changed the situation. The nobility was given the right to choose between service and private life. This was a revolutionary innovation for Russian society, where state interests had traditionally been placed above personal interests. The document contained several key provisions. First, the nobility was exempted from compulsory service, but could continue it voluntarily. Second, those who chose civil service had to serve for at least 12 years. Third, in wartime, the nobility could not leave the army without special permission. The Manifesto also granted the nobility the right to travel abroad freely. This opened up opportunities for education at European universities, the study of advanced technologies, and the establishment of trade and cultural ties. Many Russian nobles took advantage of this opportunity. Of particular importance were the provisions on the right of nobles to engage in entrepreneurship. Prior to the publication of the Manifesto, commercial activity was considered incompatible with noble dignity. Now, members of the upper class could openly engage in commerce, which contributed to the development of market relations. The Manifesto laid the foundations for the formation of civil society in Russia. Freed from compulsory service, the nobility gained the opportunity to engage in social activities, charity, and cultural projects. This contributed to the development of education, science, and the arts. The document also had important political consequences. The free nobility became more independent from state power, which created the conditions for the formation of opposition sentiments. In the long term, this led to the emergence of the Decembrist movement and other forms of political protest. The economic significance of the Manifesto cannot be overestimated. The emancipation of the nobility allowed them to manage their estates more efficiently, introduce new technologies, and develop industry. Many nobles became pioneers of Russian entrepreneurship. The cultural consequences of the Manifesto were also significant. Free time allowed the nobility to engage in literature, art, and science. It was during this period that a brilliant group of Russian writers, poets, and artists of noble origin emerged. However, the Manifesto also had negative aspects. The mass exodus of nobles from government service created a shortage of personnel in the army and the administrative apparatus. The government had to take special measures to attract employees from other classes. The social gap between the nobility and the other classes deepened. While the nobility gained freedom, the peasants remained serfs, and other classes continued to bear various duties. This created social tension, which later led to serious upheavals. The Manifesto on the freedom of the nobility became one of the most important legal acts in Russian history. It laid the foundations for the transformation of traditional society into a more modern and dynamic one. However, the original of this historical document has disappeared, making its study particularly difficult. The disappearance of the original Manifesto is symbolic. The document that freed the nobility itself was lost to obscurity. This irony of history adds drama to the search for the lost text, which continues to this day. The first documentary references to the Manifesto on the freedom of the nobility date back to the spring of 1762. Immediately after the document was published, it began to be reproduced and distributed throughout the empire. Copies were sent to provinces, military units, and educational institutions. Each copy had to strictly correspond to the original. The procedure for reproducing state documents in the 18th century was extremely regulated. Special scribes copied the text by hand, using established samples of handwriting and ink. Each copy was checked several times and then certified with the seals of the relevant departments. The first mentions of the reaction to the Manifesto are found in the diaries and letters of contemporaries. Count Mikhail Illarionovich Vorontsov wrote in his diary, "The nobility rejoices at receiving its long-awaited freedom." Similar entries can be found in many sources of the time. Foreign diplomats also recorded the publication of the Manifesto in their reports. The French ambassador, the Marquis de Breteuil, reported to Versailles about a revolutionary document that could change the entire structure of Russian society. These diplomatic dispatches became important historical sources. Church chronicles mention Thanksgiving services held in honor of the publication of the Manifesto. The nobility perceived their liberation from compulsory service as divine mercy. Some churches even installed special commemorative plaques. Of particular interest are references to the original document itself. Chamber Secretary Alexander Ivanovich Shuvalov left a note stating that the emperor signed the Manifesto with his own hand in gold ink on the finest Dutch paper. These details later helped historians identify the authenticity of various copies. The first attempts to systematize the documents related to the Manifesto were made during the reign of Catherine II. The Empress understood the historical significance of this act and ordered that all materials related to its preparation and publication be collected. A special commission was created under the leadership of State Secretary Grigory Nikolaevich Teplov. Teplov's commission worked from 1763 to 1765. Its members studied drafts of the Manifesto, correspondence between officials involved in its preparation, and eyewitness accounts of the signing ceremony. The result was a detailed report that was long considered the authoritative source on the history of the document. The Commission's report contained accurate descriptions of the original manifesto. The document was written on a sheet measuring 30 by 40 centimeters, made of high-quality paper with watermarks of the imperial crown. The text was written in calligraphic handwriting using black ink, and the emperor's signature was in gold. Particular attention was paid to the seal on the document. It was a large state seal of the Russian Empire, made of red wax with gold threads. The seal was 8 centimeters in diameter and contained a detailed image of the state coat of arms with an inscription in Latin. The first warning signs of problems with the preservation of the original appeared in the reports of archivists at the end of the 18th century. Collegiate Registrar Ivan Mikhailovich Bolotin noted in 1792 that the condition of many documents from the era of Peter III was cause for concern. Bolotin described in detail the conditions in which the documents were stored in the state archives. The rooms were not heated in winter and were very damp in summer. Many documents were kept in wooden boxes without adequate protection from rodents and insects. These factors had a negative impact on the preservation of the paper documents. In the archival inventories of 1795, the original manifesto is mentioned for the last time during the lifetime of Catherine II. Archivist Pyotr Alexandrovich Sokolov indicated that the document was in good condition and placed in a special case for particularly valuable documents. The revolutionary events of 1791 in France forced the Russian government to reconsider its policy toward historical documents. Many acts related to liberal reforms came to be seen as potentially dangerous to the stability of the regime. Emperor Paul I, who ascended the throne in 1796, was extremely negative about the legacy of Peter III. He considered his father a weak ruler and his reforms misguided. This attitude may have influenced the fate of documents from the Petrine era. Under Paul I, a large-scale reorganization of the archival system was carried out. Many documents were reclassified, moved to other repositories, or transferred to private collections. It was during this period that the first losses of important historical documents may have occurred. Private collectors played a special role in preserving historical memory. Many nobles collected documents related to the history of their families and the state. Their archives sometimes contained unique materials that had been lost in state repositories. Count Alexander Sergeyevich Stroganov was one such collector. His collection included copies of many important state documents from the 18th century. After his death, the collection was transferred to the Imperial Library, but some documents may have remained in the family archive. The first scientific studies of the history of the Manifesto began in the early 19th century. Historian Nikolai Mikhailovich Karamzin, in his History of the Russian State, examined in detail the circumstances surrounding the publication of the document. He drew on various sources, including possibly the original manifesto. Karamzin noted the special historical importance of the manifesto and expressed regret at the loss of many documents from that era. His work became the starting point for subsequent research dedicated to the search for the lost original. The imperial archives of the Russian Empire were a complex system for storing state documents that had developed over centuries. By the mid-18th century, this system had achieved a significant degree of organization, but still had serious shortcomings in terms of ensuring the preservation of particularly valuable documents. The main repository for state documents was the Moscow State Archive, located in the Kremlin. It was there that the most important documents of Peter III's brief reign, including the original Manifesto on the Freedom of the Nobility, were transferred after his death. The archive was housed in 16th-century stone chambers, which provided relative protection from fire. The organization of the archive reflected the hierarchical structure of the Russian state. The documents of the emperors were kept in special rooms, separated from the documents of less important departments. The original manifesto was placed in a special case made of sandalwood, lined with velvet, and decorated with the state coat of arms. The position of chief archivist was extremely responsible. This person was responsible for the preservation of all state documents and had access to the most secret materials. During the reign of Catherine II, this position was held by state councillor Ivan Ivanovich Betskoy, a man of high learning and impeccable reputation. Betsky introduced a new system of cataloging documents based on chronological and thematic principles. Each document was given a unique number and a detailed description. The Manifesto on the Freedom of the Nobility was registered under number 732 in the section Acts of Emperor Peter III. The storage conditions in the archive were progressive for their time. Documents were placed in special wooden cabinets, treated with insect repellents. Temperature and humidity were controlled using special devices. Access to the archive rooms was strictly limited. Special attention was paid to fire safety. After the devastating fire of 1737, when a significant part of the documents from the pre-Peter era were destroyed, strict precautions were taken. The use of open fire was prohibited in the archive rooms, even for lighting. Copying of documents was only allowed with the permission of the chief archivist. Each copy was certified with a special archive seal and the signature of the official responsible. A special journal was kept, recording all instances of access to important original documents. The chief archivist's journal contains records that the original manifesto was accessed several times during the reign of Catherine II. The Empress personally studied the document in 1764 while preparing her version of the Nobility Charter. The record states, Her Majesty deigned to examine the original manifesto for 2 hours. Catherine II showed particular interest in documents from the era of her late husband. She understood that the legitimacy of her rule was partly based on continuity with previous reforms. Therefore, the preservation and study of Peter III's documents was of political importance to her. Under Catherine II, an attempt was made to create a complete collection of Russian laws. This work required access to the originals of all the most important acts. The Manifesto on the Freedom of the Nobility was to occupy a special place in this collection, as the document that laid the foundations for a new social order. Work on the collection of laws was carried out under the direction of Senator Alexander Alexandrovich Bezborodko. His team included the best lawyers and historians of the time. They not only copied the texts of the laws, but also researched the circumstances of their adoption and analyzed their impact on the development of the state. Bezborodko's notes contain a detailed description of his work with the original manifesto. He noted the excellent condition of the document, the quality of the paper and ink, and the clarity of the emperor's signature. This information became an important source for subsequent researchers. The move of the capital to St. Petersburg created new problems for the archival system. Many important documents remained in Moscow, which made it difficult for central agencies to work with them. The question of transferring the archives to the new capital was raised periodically, but this decision was postponed due to the complexity and high cost of transportation. The condition of the archive premises in Moscow gradually deteriorated. The Kremlin chambers required major repairs, but funds for this were allocated irregularly. Dampness, temperature fluctuations, and the lack of modern ventilation systems had a negative impact on the preservation of documents. In the 1780s, archivist Semyon Ivanovich Mordvinov compiled a detailed report on the condition of the most important documents. He noted that many 18th-century documents were in critical condition and required urgent conservation measures. Among the documents of particular concern was the original manifesto. Mordvinov proposed creating special climatic conditions for storing the most valuable documents. His project included the construction of a new archive building with modern heating and ventilation systems. However, the wars with Napoleonic France that began at that time postponed the implementation of these plans. Wars posed a particular danger to the archives. During the Russo-Turkish Wars of the second half of the 18th century, the possibility of evacuating the most important documents from Moscow was considered. Special lists were drawn up of documents to be removed first, in the event of a threat of capture of the city. The original Manifesto on the Freedom of the Nobility was one of the first items on these lists. This shows that the authorities understood its exceptional historical value. The document was regarded not simply as a legal act, but as a symbol of an important stage in the development of Russian statehood. The last reliable mention of the original Manifesto in archival documents from the Catherine era dates back to 1794. The archivist noted that the document was in satisfactory condition and was kept in a special repository for particularly valuable acts. But within a few years, the situation changed dramatically. The death of Catherine II and the accession of Paul I marked the beginning of a new stage in Russian history, and with it began the story of the disappearance of one of the most important documents of the Catherine era. The end of the 18th century was a time of serious political upheaval for the Russian Empire. The French Revolution of 1789 shook the European monarchies and forced them to reconsider their attitude toward liberal ideas. Russia did not remain aloof from these processes, and the changes even affected such a conservative sphere as archival work. Emperor Paul I, who ascended the throne in 1796, differed radically from his mother Catherine II in his views on state administration. While Catherine was an admirer of the ideas of the Enlightenment, Paul sought to strengthen autocratic power and restrict any liberal tendencies. Paul I's attitude toward the legacy of Peter III was extremely contradictory. On the one hand, he considered him his father and sought to rehabilitate his memory. On the other hand, Peter III's liberal reforms seemed dangerous to him in the context of revolutionary upheavals in Europe. The Manifesto on the Freedom of the Nobility embodied the very ideas that led to the revolution in France. Paul I carried out a large-scale reform of the state apparatus, which also affected the archival system. A new position of chief archivist was created, whose job was to control all documents related to the liberal reforms of previous reigns. This measure was aimed at preventing the spread of harmful ideas. The new order required a review of the archival fonds and the identification of documents that could be used to propagate revolutionary ideas. The Manifesto on the Freedom of the Nobility was classified as a particularly dangerous act because it proclaimed principles that contradicted the absolutist ideology of Paul's reign. The chief archivist, Count Fyodor Vasilyevich Rostopchin, was known for his conservative views and uncompromising attitude toward liberal ideas. He saw his mission as protecting the monarchy from the corrupting influence of Western ideas. Under his leadership, all important state documents were reviewed. During the review, many documents were reclassified. Those containing liberal ideas were transferred to the secret or top secret category. Access to them was severely restricted, and in some cases, documents were removed from the General Archive. The Manifesto on the Freedom of the Nobility was at the center of these processes. Rostopchin personally studied the document and came to the conclusion that its content could be used to stir up a spirit of disobedience among the nobility. He recommended that the emperor take special measures to restrict access to this act. Paul I agreed with the recommendations of his chief archivist. By a special decree dated March 5, 1797, the original manifesto was removed from the General Archive and transferred to the emperor's personal repository. This decision radically changed the fate of the document. Paul I's personal repository was located in the Gatchina Palace, his country residence. The emperor preferred to spend most of his time there, surrounded by a small circle of trusted confidants. It was there that the original manifesto was transferred, along with other dangerous documents. The storage conditions in Gatchina were significantly different from those in the Moscow archive. The palace premises were not suitable for long-term storage of documents. There was no climate control system, and the necessary precautions against fire and other emergencies were not observed. I planned to create a special secret archive where all documents posing a threat to the stability of the regime would be stored. The project envisaged the construction of an underground repository with modern security systems. But the tragic events of March 11, 1801 interrupted the implementation of these plans. The assassination of Paul I, as a result of a palace conspiracy, was a turning point in the fate of many state documents. The new emperor, Alexander I, took a more liberal stance, but the chaos of the first days of his reign led to the loss of control over some archival materials. The Gatchina Palace was sealed immediately after the tragic events. A commission to inventory the deceased emperor's property worked for several months, compiling detailed lists of all the items found there. But the documents from Paul I's personal archive attracted particular attention. Many of these documents contained compromising information about various individuals involved in the political life of the empire. Some participants in the conspiracy against Paul I may have been interested in destroying such materials. This created additional risks for the preservation of the archival documents. Count Pavel Alexandrovich Stroganov, one of Alexander I's closest associates, later recalled the strange disappearances of some documents from the Gatchina archive. According to him, materials related to the liberal reforms of previous reigns were particularly affected. Attempts to find the original manifesto in the Gatchina archives were unsuccessful. This document is not mentioned in the inventory of Paul I property, although many other historical acts are listed there. This may indicate that the manifesto was removed from the archives during the emperor's lifetime. There is a version that Paul Port could have ordered the destruction of the original manifesto as a symbol of his father's liberal delusions. The emperor was prone to impulsive decisions and could have considered such a step necessary to strengthen his autocratic power. Another version suggests that the document was handed over to one of the emperor's confidants to be hidden in a safer place. In conditions of political instability, such a step might have seemed reasonable. But if this is the case, the whereabouts of the document remain unknown. The Napoleonic Wars of the early 19th century created additional threats to archival collections. Many valuable documents were evacuated or hidden due to the approach of French troops. In the ensuing chaos, further losses of historical materials may have occurred. The War of 1812 was a particularly difficult test for Russian archives. The capture of Moscow by the French and the burning of the city caused serious damage to many documentary collections. Although the main state archive was evacuated, some private collections were lost in the fire. After the war, attempts were made to restore the lost documents. Special commissions were set up to search for and return the evacuated materials. However, the original manifesto on the freedom of the nobility was not found among the documents that were recovered. The turbulent times at the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries proved fatal for many historical documents. Political upheavals, wars, and changes in archival policy all created conditions for the loss of valuable materials. The Manifesto on the Freedom of the Nobility was one of the victims of this chaotic period. The first official mention of the impossibility of finding the original Manifesto on the Freedom of the Nobility dates back to 1820. It was then, during the preparation of the complete collection of laws of the Russian Empire, that researchers discovered that the original text of the document was unavailable. This discovery came as a shock to the scientific community and government officials. Work on the complete collection of laws was initiated by Emperor Alexander I and was a grandiose project to systematize all Russian legislation. The project was led by the outstanding statesman Mikhail Mikhailovich Speransky, who understood the importance of referring to the originals of all key legislative acts. Speransky's team included the best lawyers and historians of their time. Among them were Professor Konstantin Arsenievich Nevsky of St. Petersburg University, archivist Ivan Dmitrievich Belyaev and jurist Alexander Dmitrievich Gradovsky. These scholars had access to all state archives and could work with the most secret documents. Nevsky was the first to notice the absence of the original manifesto in the Moscow archives. In his report dated September 7, 1823, he wrote, "Upon careful examination of the archival fonds, the original manifesto on the freedom of the nobility could not be found." This report caused serious concern among the project's leadership. Speransky personally arrived in Moscow to verify this information. He spent several days in the archives, studying catalogs and personally reviewing documents from the era of Peter III. The result was disappointing. The original was indeed missing, and the last mention of it dated back to the end of the 18th century. A large-scale search operation was organized. All state archives, private collections, and monastery libraries were checked. Provincial archivists were called in to search their collections for any documents related to the original manifesto. Particular attention was paid to the archives of families who could have been involved in the events of 1762. The collections of the Shuvalov, Vorontsov, Panin, Volkonsky, and other noble families were checked. But even these searches were unsuccessful. Belyaev attempted to trace the fate of the document through archival records. He studied all the document issuance journals, property inventories, and correspondence between archivists. He found the last reliable mention of the original in the Journal of the Moscow Archive for the year 1794. Belyaev's research showed that during the reign of Paul I, many liberal documents were removed from the general archives. The Manifesto on the Freedom of the Nobility could have been one of these documents. But traces of its further fate were lost in the chaos of the palace coup of 1801. Gradovsky put forward the hypothesis that the original could have been destroyed during the Napoleonic invasion. Many Moscow mansions and estates were looted or burned by French soldiers. If the document was kept in a private collection, it could have been destroyed in the fire. The search continued for several years. Historians from other countries joined in, as there was a possibility that the document had been taken abroad. Archives in Berlin, Paris, Vienna, and London were searched, but the search abroad also proved fruitless. Speransky decided to include the text of the manifesto in the complete collection of laws based on early copies. The most reliable copy was considered to be the one from the Senate archives, certified with the seal and signatures of contemporaries. This text became the official version of the document for all subsequent publications. The failure to find the original became a topic of discussion in the highest circles of the empire. Emperor Alexander I was personally interested in the results of the work and expressed regret at the loss of such an important historical document. He ordered the search to continue and offered a special reward to anyone who could find the original. Nicholas I, who ascended the throne in 1825, also showed interest in the search for the lost document. Under him, a special archaeographic commission was created to search for and publish historical sources. The search for the manifesto became one of the commission's priority tasks. The chairman of the commission, Pavel Mikhailovich Stroyev, organized a systematic search throughout the empire. Circulars were sent to all provinces with a request to check local archives. Particular attention was paid to church and monastery collections, where unique documents were sometimes preserved. Stroyev personally made several expeditions to ancient Russian cities. He visited Novgorod, Pskov, Vologda, and Yaroslavl, studying local archives and private collections. In Yaroslavl, he made an interesting discovery, a draft of Peter III's letter to Volkov with notes on the preparation of the manifesto. This draft contained important information about the work on the text of the document. It mentioned various wording options, discussions of controversial points, and plans for the signing ceremony. The find confirmed the authenticity of the known copies of the manifesto, but did not bring the discovery of the original any closer. In the 1830s, foreign researchers joined the search. German historians were particularly interested as Peter III had German roots. Professor Leopold von Ranke of the University of Berlin even made a special trip to Russia to study the issue. Ranke suggested that the document could have been taken to Holstein by relatives of Peter III. He searched the archives of Kiel and other Holstein cities but found no trace of the Manifesto. However, his work drew the attention of the European public to the problem of the lost document. The search in the first half of the 19th century laid the foundations for a scientific approach to studying the fate of the missing original. The chronological framework of its disappearance was established. Possible reasons for its loss were identified, and the main versions of what happened were formulated. But the document itself was never found. Concern about the disappearance of the original reflected a growing understanding of the value of historical sources. The 19th century was a time when scientific historiography was taking shape, and access to authentic documents was seen as a necessary condition for an objective study of the past. The 19th century was a time of flourishing historical science in Russia. Growing interest in the country's past prompted researchers to study archival materials more thoroughly. The disappearance of the original Manifesto on the freedom of the nobility became one of the central mysteries of Russian historiography, attracting the attention of leading scholars of the time. Nikolai Mikhailovich Karamzin, creator of History of the Russian State, was one of the first to professionally search for the lost document. In 1835, he received special permission from the emperor to access all state archives to write the final volumes of his work. Karamzin approached the search with his characteristic methodicalness. He not only searched for the original itself, but also collected all the information about its fate. The historian interviewed many contemporaries of Paul I who were still alive at the time. Among them was the elderly Count Fyodor Petrovich Tolstoy, who had served at court in the late 18th century. Tolstoy told Karamzin an interesting story. According to him, Paul I did indeed take documents from previous reigns that he considered unreliable into his personal archive. The emperor was convinced that liberal ideas posed a threat to the monarchy, especially after the events in France. Karamzin also spoke with Yekaterina Alexandrovna Narishkina, a lady-in-waiting to Catherine II, who remembered the circumstances of working with historical documents at court. She confirmed that Catherine II personally studied the Manifesto while preparing her Charter of Privileges for the nobility of 1785. Of particular value were the memoirs of Dmitry Ivanovich Yazikov, who served in the archives in his youth and personally saw the original Manifesto. He described the appearance of the document in detail. The sheet was made of the finest paper with watermarks of the crown. The text was written in clear handwriting, and the emperor's signature was in gold ink. Yazikov also reported an important detail. Under Paul I, a special commission worked in the archives to seize dangerous documents. It was headed by State Councillor Alexander Semyonovich Norov, known for his conservative views. The commission operated in strict secrecy, and its decisions were not documented. Karamzin tried to find traces of Norov's commission, but most of its members had already died by that time. He managed to find only one, collegiate advisor Nikolai Andreevich Polivan-Kremnitsky, who confirmed the seizure of many documents but refused to name specific ones for reasons of state secrecy. Karamzin's search in the Moscow archives continued for several months. He methodically studied all the funds related to the era of Peter III. Particular attention was paid to the documents of the secret chancellery, which could contain information about the fate of the liberal acts of previous reigns. In the archives of the secret chancellery, Karamzin discovered an interesting document, a note by an unknown author mentioning the concealment of dangerous acts from the time of Peter III. The note was dated 1798 and contained the mysterious phrase, "By the highest order, the documents have been transferred to a safe place." This discovery was the first serious clue to solving the mystery. Karamzin suggested that the safe place could refer to some kind of secret repository created by order of Paul I. But where it could be located and whether it still existed remained a mystery. The next stage of the search is connected with the name of Sergei Mikhailovich Solovyov, an outstanding Russian historian of the 19th century. In the 1850s, he undertook the most systematic attempt to find the lost original. Solovyov had unique access to archival materials and was able to work with documents that were unavailable to other researchers. Solovyov began by studying the personal archives of families associated with the court of Paul I. He paid particular attention to the Rostopchin collection, as Count Fyodor Vasilievich Rostopchin held the position of chief archivist under Paul I. The Rostopchin family archive was kept at their estate in Voronovo, near Moscow. In the Voronovo archives, Solovyov discovered Rostopchin's correspondence with the emperor concerning archival policy. In one of the letters dated April 12, 1797, Rostopchin reported, "In accordance with your Majesty's orders, dangerous documents have been removed and transferred to a special repository." The letter did not contain any specific indication of the location of this repository, but it mentioned a place known only to your Majesty and me. Solovyov suggested that this could have been some kind of secret room in one of Paul I's palaces. The historian carefully studied the plans of all the emperor's residences, the Gatchina and Pavlovsk palaces, and the Mikhailovsky castle in St. Petersburg. In the architectural drawings, he looked for indications of secret rooms or underground rooms that could serve as a secret repository. In the plans for the Gatchina Palace, Solovyov did indeed find references to underground rooms with no obvious purpose. These rooms were located under the emperor's private quarters and were accessible only through a secret passage from his study. The historian suggested that this could be the location of the secret repository. Solovyov appealed to the authorities for permission to explore the underground passages of the Gatchina Palace. After lengthy negotiations, permission was granted. In 1857, an expedition was organized to uncover the mystery of the missing document. The underground rooms were examined with the participation of architects, historians, and representatives of the palace administration. Several blocked passages and walled-up rooms were discovered. In one of them, the remains of wooden furniture and metal boxes were found, but they were empty. Traces of fire in the basement indicated that there had once been a fire here. Solovyov suggested that the secret repository might have been damaged by fire and the documents destroyed. However, the absence of any remains of paper or parchment cast doubt on this version. The failure of the search in Gatchina did not deter Solovyov. He continued to study archival materials and soon came across another interesting find. In the archives of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, he discovered a report by the Moscow governor from 1812 on measures to save archival materials during the Napoleonic invasion. The report mentioned that particularly valuable state documents had been evacuated from Moscow to Nizhny Novgorod. Among them were documents from the reigns of Peter III and Paul I. Solovyov became interested in this information and went to Nizhny Novgorod to study the local archives. In the Nizhny Novgorod archives, the historian did indeed find traces of the evacuated Moscow documents. Most of them were returned to Moscow after the end of the war, but some remained in Nizhny Novgorod for various reasons. The original manifesto was not among the remaining documents. Solovyov also studied the private collections of Nizhny Novgorod nobles, who could have acquired historical documents during the chaos of wartime. Of particular interest was the collection of Count Dmitry Nikolaevich Sheremetev, known for his passion for history. The Sheremetev archive contained many interesting documents from the 18th century, including some acts from the time of Peter III. However, the original manifesto on the freedom of the nobility was not found there either. Count Sheremetev personally confirmed to Solovyov that such a document had never been in his collection. Solovyov's search continued for more than 10 years. He studied archives in Moscow, St. Petersburg, provincial cities, private collections, and monastery libraries. The historian interviewed hundreds of people who might have had some information about the lost document. but all efforts were in vain. In his memoirs, Solovyov wrote, "The search for the original manifesto became for me not just a scientific task, but almost an obsession. I felt that the key to the mystery was somewhere nearby, but I couldn't find it." These words reflect the scale of the problem that captured the minds of 19th century historians. The failures of the 19th century search laid the foundation for a multitude of theories and assumptions about the fate of the document. Some researchers believed that the original had been deliberately destroyed for political reasons. Others assumed that it had been accidentally destroyed during wars or fires. A third group of historians put forward the theory that the document still exists but is in private hands. This theory gained particular traction due to the growing popularity of historical collecting among wealthy people at the time. The revolutionary events of 1917 marked a new milestone in the search for the lost manifesto. The fall of the monarchy and the Bolsheviks' rise to power radically changed attitudes toward historical documents. What had previously been considered a state secret was now subject to open study as part of the struggle against the remnants of the past. In the first months of its existence, the provisional government decided to declassify the archives of the Tsarist era. A special commission was set up to study the documents of the overthrown regime. It was headed by the renowned historian Alexander Sergeyevich Lapo-Danilevsky, who had long been interested in the fate of the missing manifesto. Lapo-Danilevsky was granted unprecedented access to archives that had previously been closed to researchers. For the first time in a century and a half, scholars were able to study the personal papers of the emperors, documents from the third section, and materials from the secret police. Hopes of finding traces of the manifesto were very high. The commission began its work in the archives of the Winter Palace. In Nicholas II's private chambers, safes containing secret documents that the emperor had personally studied were discovered. Among them were materials on the search for various lost historical documents, including correspondence with historians about the fate of the Manifesto on the freedom of the nobility. The correspondence revealed that Nicholas II was keenly interested in this issue. In 1905, he even set up a secret commission to search for the document, but its activities were curtailed due to the revolutionary events. The commission's materials contained interesting versions of the possible location of the original. One version pointed to Tsarskoye Selo as a possible place where the document could be stored. According to the commission members, Catherine II could have moved particularly valuable documents from the Winter Palace there. The Empress's personal library, with a secret section, did indeed exist in the Catherine Palace. Lapo-Danilevsky personally inspected Catherine II's library in Tsarskoye Selo. Hundreds of 18th century documents were kept in the secret compartment, many of which had previously been considered lost. Among the finds were drafts of Catherine II's decrees, personal correspondence with European monarchs, and plans for state reforms. However, the original manifesto was not found there. Instead, an interesting document was discovered. A note by Catherine II with her thoughts on the fate of documents from the era of Peter III. In the note, the Empress wrote, "Some of the acts of my late husband are better left forgotten, so as not to confuse the minds of my subjects." This discovery confirmed the theory that Catherine II may have deliberately hidden or destroyed some of Peter III's documents. Perhaps she considered the Manifesto on the freedom of the nobility too liberal and dangerous for the stability of the regime. This approach was characteristic of the Empress's policy in the early years of her reign. The October Revolution interrupted the work of the Lapo-Danilevsky Commission. The Bolsheviks came to power with completely different views on historical heritage. They regarded documents from the Tsarist era primarily as sources of information about the crimes of autocracy against the people. The new government created the main archival administration, headed by the old Bolshevik David Borisovich Ryazanov. Ryazanov was known as a Marxist theorist and had no special historical education, but he possessed organizational skills and revolutionary enthusiasm. Ryazanov set the task of completely revising all archival fonds in order to identify documents that, exposed the essence of the Tsarist regime. The Manifesto on the Freedom of the Nobility was seen as an example of the hypocrisy of autocracy, which freed the nobility but enslaved the peasants. The search for the original manifesto under Soviet rule took on an ideological character. The document was needed not so much for scientific purposes as for propaganda. It was planned to be used as a vivid example of the class nature of Tsarist politics. The best Soviet historians were enlisted in the search. Among them was Mikhail Nikolaevich Pokrovsky, the founder of the Marxist school of Russian historiography. Pokrovsky personally studied the problem of the manifesto's disappearance and put forward his own version of what had happened. According to Pokrovsky, the original manifesto was destroyed by the nobles themselves during the Revolution of 1905. They feared that the document could be used against them by the revolutionaries as it emphasized the privileged position of the upper class. This version seemed logical from the point of view of class struggle, but had no documentary evidence. Pokrovsky based his theory on general arguments about the behavior of exploitative classes in times of crisis, rather than on specific facts. In the 1920s, Soviet historians gained access to previously unavailable private archives. Many noble families had emigrated or been repressed, and their documentary collections became state property. This created new opportunities to search for the lost manifesto. The archives of families associated with the 18th century court were of particular interest. The collections of the Golitsyn, Dolgoruki, Trubetskoy, Vyazemsky, and other noble families were examined. A copy of the manifesto with notes in an unknown hand was found in the Golitsyn prince's archive, but it was not the original. The copy from the Golitsyn archive proved to be very interesting. Notes containing critical remarks about Peter III's policies were made in the margins of the document. The handwriting could not be identified, but the style of the remarks indicated a highly educated contemporary of the events. The Civil War caused serious damage to archival collections. Many estates and palaces were looted or burned down. Unique documents may have been destroyed in the fire, including possibly the original manifesto, if it was kept in a private collection. Archives in combat zones were particularly affected. Estates near Moscow, where 18th century documents could have been stored, were looted by various military formations, Reds, Whites, Greens. All participants in the conflict cared little about the preservation of historical monuments. The Soviet authorities attempted to organize the rescue of surviving archival materials. Special commissions were set up to collect documents in the affected areas, but much had already been irretrievably lost. The revolutionary losses became a new chapter in the sad history of the lost manifesto. By the end of the 1920s, it became clear that the revolutionary events had significantly reduced the chances of finding the original document. If it still existed in 1917, the chaos of the revolution and civil war could have caused its final loss. The Soviet period brought new opportunities for searching for the lost manifesto, but at the same time created additional difficulties. Ideological attitudes required historical documents to be viewed through the prism of class struggle, which sometimes distorted scientific objectivity. Nevertheless, Soviet historians made an important contribution to the study of the disappearance of the original. In the 1930s, research was led by academician Evgeny Viktorovich Tarl, one of the few pre-revolutionary historians who managed to adapt to the new conditions. Tarl had extensive knowledge of the 18th century and personally knew many collectors from the Tsarist era who might have had information about the lost documents. Tarl suggested that the search should focus on archives related to the Napoleonic era. He assumed that many documents could have been moved or lost during the War of 1812. This version required the study of not only Russian but also French archives. As part of cultural cooperation with France in the mid-1930s, joint research was organized. French historians checked archives related to the Napoleonic period for Russian documents taken during the occupation of Moscow. The results were unexpected. The archives of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs did indeed contain some Russian documents from the 18th century, but they had not been obtained as war trophies, but through diplomatic channels. Among them were copies of some decrees of Catherine II, but not the original Manifesto. A more interesting find was made in the private archives of Marshal Michel Ney's family. Among the papers of the famous commander, documents related to the French army's stay in Moscow were discovered. One of the lists of trophies mentioned Russian letters and decrees taken from various Moscow palaces. Unfortunately, the documents themselves had not survived by that time. The Marshal's grandson sold most of the archive to various collectors back in the 19th century. The traces of the buyers were lost in time, but the fact that Russian documents were taken out of the country by the French was documented. Tarl organized a search for traces of Russian documents in private collections in Europe. Soviet diplomats, who had the opportunity to contact foreign collectors, joined in this work. Particular attention was paid to Germany, where there was traditionally a high interest in Russian history. In Berlin, interesting materials were found in the archives of the Prussian General Staff. Documents related to Russian-Prussian relations in the 18th century were stored there. Among them was correspondence between Prussian diplomats with references to secret acts of Russian emperors. One of the documents contained curious information. The Prussian ambassador in St. Petersburg reported in 1798 that Emperor Paul ordered some of his father's documents to be hidden, fearing their political impact. This confirmed the version of the deliberate concealment of the Manifesto. The Second World War interrupted international research. Moreover, it brought new losses of archival materials. The German occupation of part of the USSR was accompanied by the systematic destruction of cultural treasures. Many regional archives were looted or destroyed. The archives in Novgorod, Pskov, and Smolensk, cities with a rich history where documents from the 18th century could have been stored, were particularly affected. The Nazis deliberately destroyed historical materials as part of their policy of denationalization of the occupied territories. After the war, Soviet historians attempted to assess the extent of the losses. A special commission headed by academician Boris Dmitrievich Grekov studied the state of the archives in the liberated areas. The results were depressing. Many unique documents were irretrievably lost. Grekov suggested that if the original Manifesto had been kept in one of the regional archives, it could have been destroyed during the war. This version explained why such intensive searches in the central archives had been unsuccessful. The document could have been in the provinces. In the 1950s, a new generation of Soviet historians joined the search. Among them was Nikolai Pavlenko, a specialist in 18th century history. Pavlenko applied new research methods based on systematic analysis of archival fonds. Pavlenko compiled a detailed map of all known movements of documents from the era of Peter III. He traced the paths of various acts into the archives, their subsequent movements, and cases of copying. This work revealed several blank spots in the fate of the documents. One such blank spot was related to the archive of Prince Alexander Mikhailovich Golitsyn, Minister of Public Education under Alexander I. Golitsyn was known as a collector of historical documents, and his collection may have contained unique materials from the 18th century. After Golitsyn's death, his archive was divided among his heirs. Some of the documents ended up in the Rumyantsev Museum, while others remained in the family. The family's part of the archive was lost during the revolutionary upheavals. Pavlenko suggested that the original Manifesto could have been kept there. The search for Golitsyn's archive continued for several years. It was established that some of the documents had been taken abroad by emigrants. In the 1960s, these materials appeared at auctions in Paris and London. The Soviet government tried to return them, but most had already been sold to private collectors. Among the documents sold at auction were interesting materials from the 18th century, but the original Manifesto was not among them. This did not rule out the possibility that it could have been sold earlier or be located in another part of Golitsyn's archive. In the 1970s, Soviet historians gained new opportunities for international cooperation. The policy of détente made it possible to establish contacts with Western colleagues and organize joint research to find lost Russian documents. Cooperation with American researchers proved particularly fruitful. The U.S. had archives of many Russian emigrants, which could contain documents from the pre-revolutionary era. Joint efforts revealed several previously unknown materials on the history of the 18th century. However, the main goal, to find the original manifesto on the freedom of the nobility, was never achieved. By the end of the Soviet period, it had become clear that traditional search methods had reached their limits. New approaches based on modern technologies and research methods were needed. Soviet research made an important contribution to understanding the problem. A detailed chronology of the document's disappearance was created. The main versions of what happened were identified, and an extensive bibliography on the subject was compiled. But the original itself remained an unattainable goal, a symbol of lost historical heritage. The search for the original Manifesto of the Nobility began outside Russia in the 19th century, but intensified in the 20th century. The revolutionary events, civil war, and mass emigration led to many Russian documents ending up in foreign archives and private collections. The first systematic research into foreign traces was undertaken in the 1920s. Russian emigrants, among whom were many historians and archivists, began to establish centers for the study of Russian history abroad. One such center was the Russian Historical Archive in Prague. The archive in Prague was created with the support of the Czechoslovak government and brought together the efforts of many Russian émigré scholars. It was headed by Professor Alexander Alexandrovich Kiesewetter, a renowned specialist in 18th century history. Kiesewetter was personally interested in the fate of the lost manifesto and organized a special search. The Prague archive became a center for collecting information about Russian documents in private hands. Many emigrants brought their family archives with them, some of which contained unique historical materials. Kiesewetter hoped that the original manifesto might be found among these documents. Of particular interest was the collection of Prince Sergei Mikhailovich Volkonsky, the great-grandson of a Decembrist. His archive contained documents related to the history of the Volkonsky family, which played an important role at the court of the 18th century. Among the prince's ancestors were people who could have had access to state documents from the era of Peter III. The Volkonsky archive did indeed contain interesting materials. Among them was correspondence between his ancestor, General-in-Chief Mikhail Nikitich Volkonsky, and his contemporaries about the political events of the 18th century. One of the letters mentioned the secret storage of important state documents. The letter was dated 1799 and was addressed to an unknown correspondent. Volkonsky wrote that troubled times require special caution in handling documents that could be misinterpreted. This may have referred to documents of a liberal nature, including the Manifesto. Kiesewetter also investigated the possibility that Russian documents may have found their way into Western European archives at an earlier date. In the 18th and 19th centuries, there was a practice of diplomatic exchanges of documents, as well as their sale by private individuals to foreign collectors. Particular attention was paid to London, where there was traditionally a high level of interest in Russian historical materials. The British Museum and private collections contained many documents related to the history of Russia. Kiesewetter established contacts with British colleagues to organize joint searches. The British Museum housed an extensive collection of Russian documents, gathered in various ways over the centuries. Among them were materials from the 18th century, including some decrees and manifestos of Russian emperors. The cataloging of this collection was incomplete, which gave hope for new discoveries. Museum employee Samuel Harper, a specialist in Russian studies, undertook a special study of Russian materials in British collections. He studied not only museum collections, but also the private archives of aristocratic families, that had historically maintained ties with Russia. In the archives of the Dukes of Devonshire, Harper discovered interesting correspondence with Russian diplomats of the 18th century. Among the documents was a copy of a letter from the British ambassador in St. Petersburg mentioning an important act of Emperor Peter, which caused great excitement among the Russian nobility. This reference referred to the period when the Manifesto was published and confirmed its international resonance. However, the document itself, or copies of it, could not be found in British archives. Harper suggested that the Russian side did not provide foreign diplomats with the full texts of internal legislative acts. At the same time, searches were conducted in Germany, which historically had close ties with Russia. Many German nobles served at the Russian court, and German princesses became Russian empresses. These ties could have contributed to Russian documents ending up in German archives. Professor Otto Hochschild of Berlin University, a renowned specialist in Eastern European history, organized a systematic study of German archives. Particular attention was paid to materials related to Holstein, the homeland of Peter III. It was assumed that the documents could have been transferred there through family ties. The archives of the Dukes of Holstein-Gottorp did indeed contain some Russian documents, but these mainly related to an earlier period. The materials from the era of Peter III consisted of only a few personal letters. No traces of the Manifesto were found. The search in France seemed more promising, as there was a particularly high interest in Russian affairs in the 18th century. French diplomats closely followed Russian domestic politics and were able to obtain copies of important legislative acts through various channels. The archives of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs contained an extensive collection of documents related to Russian-French relations. Among them were reports from French ambassadors with detailed descriptions of political events in Russia, including the publication of the Manifesto on the freedom of the nobility. French historian Albert Vandel, who specialized in the history of Franco-Russian relations, discovered an interesting document in the archives. It was a report by the ambassador, the Marquis de Breteuil, dated March 1762, with a detailed analysis of the significance of the Manifesto for Russian society. The report contained an interesting remark. Received a copy of this revolutionary document from a reliable source at court. This testified that the French did indeed have access to the text of the Manifesto. But where this copy was located and whether it had survived remained unclear. Searches in other parts of the French archives were unsuccessful. Vandel suggested that the copy might have been destroyed during the French Revolution, when many documents associated with the old regime were burned. Revolutionaries might have viewed them as symbols of aristocratic privilege. American research began later but proved to be very productive. Many Russian emigrants settled in the United States, bringing their family archives with them. In addition, American collectors actively purchased Russian historical materials at European auctions. The U.S. Library of Congress became the center for the study of Russian documents in America. Frank Golder, the leading American specialist in Russian history, worked there. Golder organized a systematic search for Russian materials in American collections. The most interesting collection was that of industrialist and patron Henry Huntington. His collection included documents acquired from European antique dealers. Among them were Russian materials from the 18th century, the origin of which was often unclear. In Huntington's collection, Golder discovered a fragment of an 18th century Russian document mentioning the freedom of the noble class. Expert analysis showed that it was indeed part of a document from the era of Peter III, but not the Manifesto itself, and possibly one of the preparatory materials. This discovery fueled interest in the American search. Private collections in New York, Boston, and Chicago were checked. Several interesting Russian documents from the 18th century were found, but the original Manifesto was not among them. The search abroad continued throughout the 20th century, but never led to the discovery of the original. Nevertheless, it did reveal a wealth of previously unknown material related to the history of the Manifesto's creation and faith. These findings broadened our understanding of the historical context and circumstances surrounding the document's disappearance. Private collections have always played a special role in the preservation of historical documents. In 18th–19th century Russia, many members of noble families collected archives that included not only family materials, but also state documents that came into their possession through various channels. After the Revolution, a significant part of these collections was scattered, which created new opportunities for the search for the lost Manifesto. Count Sergei Dmitrievich Sheremetev was one of the most famous collectors in pre-revolutionary Russia. His collection in Ostafyevo near Moscow was considered one of the richest private archives in the empire. Sheremetev purposefully collected documents from the 18th century, paying particular attention to the era of Catherine II and her predecessors. The Sheremetev archive contained unique materials, including correspondence between emperors, draft decrees, and memoirs of courtiers. The Count had connections in the highest circles and was able to obtain documents that were inaccessible to ordinary researchers. There was a theory that the original Manifesto could have been in his collection. After Sheremetev's death in 1903, his archive was divided among his heirs. Most of the documents remained in Ostafyevo, but some materials were transferred to other members of the family. The revolution led to the final dispersal of the collection. Part of Sheremetev's archive was nationalized and transferred to state repositories. Another part was taken abroad by emigrants. The third part was sold or hidden in Russia. It proved almost impossible to trace the fate of all the documents, which gave rise to many legends and assumptions. In the 1920s, Parisian antique dealer Paul Desfontaines put up for sale a collection of Russian documents, allegedly from the Sheremetev archive. Among the items on display were 18th century decrees, letters from emperors, and memoirs of courtiers. Soviet representatives tried to buy the collection, but it was sold to an American collector. American millionaire John Pierpont Morgan purchased Desfontaines' documents for his library in New York. It took several years to catalog the collection. The documents did indeed include valuable 18th century materials, but the original Manifesto was not among them. Another part of Sheremetev's archive resurfaced in Berlin in the 1930s. German antique dealer Marcus Rosenberg offered Soviet diplomats the opportunity to purchase a unique collection of documents belonging to Russian Tsars. Negotiations were conducted in strict secrecy. Rosenberg claimed that the documents had been taken out of Russia by a Russian émigré who needed money. Among the materials offered were decrees of Peter III, including, according to the dealer, a particularly important manifesto on the nobility. The Soviet side was interested in this information. However, verification showed that the documents offered were copies, not originals. Some of them were so skillfully made that they could have fooled a non-specialist, but expert examination revealed signs of forgery. Rosenberg disappeared before the negotiations were completed. The Rosenberg incident showed that a real black market had formed around the lost Manifesto. Fraudsters tried to cash in on the interest of collectors and government organizations in this document. Dozens of forgeries of varying quality appeared. Prince Felix Felixovich Yusupov, a well-known participant in the assassination of Rasputin, also sold family heirlooms after emigrating. In 1925, he put part of his family's archive up for auction in London. The auction catalog mentioned documents from the time of Catherine II and her predecessors. The Yusupov archive attracted the attention of many collectors and researchers. The Yusupov family was one of the richest in Russia and had connections at court for centuries. Theoretically, unique state documents could have been preserved in their archive. The auction was a great success, but the original Manifesto was not among the documents sold. Buyers mainly acquired family correspondence, household documents, and several 18th century decrees of local significance. The disappointment was universal. In the post-war years, the search in private collections intensified. Many European families affected by the war were forced to sell their family archives. This created new opportunities for discovering previously inaccessible documents. The collection of the Austrian Habsburgs was of particular interest. This family had maintained diplomatic relations with Russia for centuries, and their archives could have preserved copies of important Russian documents obtained through diplomatic channels. The Habsburg archives did indeed contain interesting materials on the history of 18th century Russia. Among them were reports by Austrian diplomats on the internal politics of Russian emperors. One of the documents contained a detailed description of the reaction of European courts to the publication of the Manifesto. The Austrian ambassador in St. Petersburg reported to Vienna, "The Russian emperor's act of freeing the nobility from service aroused lively interest in all European capitals. Many see it as an example to follow." However, no copies of the Manifesto itself were found in the Habsburg archives. The search in private collections was complicated by the fact that many owners were unwilling to grant access to their archives. They feared that their documents might contain materials of dubious origin, which would create legal problems. In the 1960s, Swiss banker Hans Müller offered Soviet representatives information about the location of important Russian documents from the 18th century. According to him, the documents were kept in a private collection in Switzerland and included the Russian Tsar's Manifesto on the nobility. Negotiations with Müller were conducted through intermediaries for several months. The banker demanded a significant sum not only for the documents themselves, but also for information about their location. The Soviet side was prepared to pay if the authenticity of the documents was confirmed. However, a meeting to examine the documents never took place. Müller suddenly broke off negotiations, citing changed circumstances. It later emerged that he had no Russian documents and that the whole story was a hoax intended to obtain money. By the end of the 20th century, it became clear that searches in private collections, although yielding interesting finds, were not bringing the discovery of the original Manifesto any closer. Most serious collections had been studied, and information about the document's whereabouts had not been confirmed. Nevertheless, private collections remain a potential source of new discoveries. Many family archives have not yet been studied by professional historians. Perhaps one of the most important documents in Russian history is still stored somewhere in a forgotten chest or family safe. The history of the search in private collections has shown how difficult it is to trace the fate of historical documents after they leave official archives. Revolutions, wars, and emigration create chaos in which even the most valuable artifacts can disappear without a trace. The end of the 20th and beginning of the 21st centuries were marked by revolutionary changes in archival work. Digital technologies have opened up new opportunities for searching, cataloging, and studying historical documents. Computer databases, scanning, and online resources have all created conditions for a more effective search for the lost Manifesto on the freedom of the nobility. In the 1990s, the Russian state launched a large-scale program to digitize its archival collections. Under the leadership of Vladimir Petrovich Kozlov, Rosarchiv set itself an ambitious task: to create electronic catalogs of all the most important documents in Russian history and make them available online. The digitization program included not only scanning documents, but also creating detailed descriptions with keywords that would allow users to quickly find the materials they needed. Particular attention was paid to documents from the 18th century, as many of them were in critical condition. Kozlov personally oversaw the project to find the lost Manifesto. A special working group was set up to use computer methods to analyze all known references to the document. The aim was to identify possible locations where it might currently be found. Computer analysis made it possible to compile a detailed map of all the movements of documents from the era of Peter III. The database included information about when and where each document was mentioned, who had access to it, and what copies were made. This work required the processing of a huge amount of archival material. The results of the analysis were unexpected. The computer revealed several previously unnoticed connections between various references to the Manifesto. In particular, a correlation was found between the disappearance of the document and the activities of certain individuals at the court of Paul I. The analysis showed that the last reliable references to the original coincided with the period of activity of a secret commission for the seizure of dangerous documents. This confirmed the version of the deliberate concealment of the Manifesto for political reasons. The Internet opened up new opportunities for international cooperation in the search for lost documents. Specialized websites were created where researchers from different countries could exchange information about found materials and coordinate their search efforts. The Lost Treasures of Russia project brought together historians, archivists, and collectors from many countries. The project website provided detailed information about the Manifesto, including its description, history, and all known traces. Anyone could report possible finds. Thanks to the Internet project, several previously unknown copies of the Manifesto were found in private collections. One of them was found in the archives of the descendants of Russian immigrants in Canada. Another was found by a collector in Australia. Although these were not originals, each find expanded our understanding of the document's history. The find in Toronto proved particularly interesting. There, a copy of the Manifesto with notes in the margins was kept by the family of a White Guard officer's descendants. Expert analysis showed that the notes were made by someone who was very familiar with the history of the document. It is possible that it was one of the historians of the 19th century. Text recognition technology made it possible to process huge arrays of handwritten documents from the 18th and 19th centuries. Computer programs learned to read old handwriting and search for keywords in texts. This accelerated the search for references to the Manifesto in archival collections. Artificial intelligence was used to analyze the style and content of various copies of the Manifesto. Programs compared texts, identified differences in wording, and determined the most reliable versions. This work helped to clarify the authentic text of the document. High-resolution scanning of the documents revealed details invisible to the naked eye. Traces of watermarks, paper characteristics, and seal remnants were found on some copies of the Manifesto. This information was important for understanding the technology used to produce the original. Spectral analysis of the ink on various copies showed that some of them could have been made in the 18th century. This made it possible to separate authentic historical copies from later forgeries. The authentic copies became valuable sources of information about the original. Geographic information systems helped visualize all known movements of documents related to the Manifesto. The locations of storage, evacuation routes, and possible hiding places were marked on an electronic map. This map became a tool for planning new searches. Social networks proved to be unexpectedly useful for the search. Through Facebook and other platforms, it was possible to find descendants of people who might have been connected to the history of the document. Some of them provided family stories or documents that shed light on the fate of the Manifesto. Crowdsourcing, the involvement of a wide range of volunteers in scientific research, became an important tool in the search. Thousands of enthusiasts around the world studied digitized archival documents looking for references to the Manifesto. Some of the findings proved to be very valuable. Blockchain technology began to be used to create immutable registries of historical documents. Each finding related to the Manifesto was recorded in the blockchain with all the details. This created a reliable database for future research. Virtual reality made it possible to create a three-dimensional model of all the places where the original Manifesto could have been stored. Researchers could visit historical archives, palaces, and estates in their original form, and better understand the logic behind the placement of documents. Machine learning was used to analyze 18th-century handwriting. Algorithms were trained to recognize the handwriting of Peter III and his contemporaries. This helped to quickly identify authentic documents from that era among the vast amount of material in the archives. Quantum computers, although still in the development stage, promise to revolutionize the processing of historical data. Their computing power will make it possible to analyze connections between millions of documents and identify hidden patterns. Drones and satellite imaging are used to search for hidden archives and caches. Some old estates and monasteries may contain walled-up rooms with documents. Modern technology makes it possible to discover them without destroying historic buildings. Despite all the technological advances, the original Manifesto of the Nobility has not yet been found. However, modern methods have greatly expanded the search possibilities and made it possible to gather an unprecedented amount of information about the fate of this important historical document. 21st century technology has given hope that the mystery of the Manifesto's disappearance will finally be solved. Every year, new tools and methods emerge that could lead to a breakthrough in the search. Modern researchers are continuing the work of their predecessors, using all the possibilities of the digital age. The history of the search for the lost Manifesto is replete with copies and forgeries of varying quality and origin. Over 2.5 centuries, many versions of the document have been created, ranging from conscientious attempts to restore the text to outright fraudulent forgeries. The study of these materials has become a separate field of research, allowing for a better understanding of the authentic text of the original. The first copies of the Manifesto were made almost immediately after its publication in 1762. These were official copies intended for distribution to the provinces and military units. They were produced in the emperor's office under strict control and had to correspond exactly to the original. The most authoritative copy is considered to be the one from the archives of the governing Senate, made in March 1762. This copy was certified with the seals of several senators and signed by State Secretary Dmitry Vasilyevich Volkov. It was this copy that formed the basis for the publication of the Manifesto in the complete collection of laws. The Senate copy was kept in special conditions and has been studied by experts on numerous occasions. Analysis of the paper and ink confirmed that it dates back to the 18th century. Handwriting analysis established that the text was written by a professional scribe of the Chancellery at that time. The copy from the Foreign Affairs Collegium archive has some interesting features. It contains minor discrepancies with the Senate version, mainly in punctuation and the spelling of individual words. Experts suggest that this copy was made from a draft of the Manifesto, rather than the final version. The copy from the Collegium of Foreign Affairs has several crossed-out words and corrections, which may indicate that the text was edited. Perhaps this is what the working version of the document looked like before the final edit. These details help to understand the process of creating the Manifesto. The third important copy is from the Military Collegium archives. It was made for distribution to the troops and has extra notes on how soldiers should read the document. There are notes in the margins about who read the Manifesto and when. Noble family archives also had copies of the Manifesto. Many members of noble families ordered personal copies of this important document. The quality of these copies varied, depending on the skills and diligence of the copyists. The Sheremetev family archive has a copy made on special paper with the family's watermarks. The text is written in calligraphic handwriting and decorated with colored initials. This shows the importance that representatives of the highest nobility attached to the document. A copy from the archives of the Golitsyn princes is interesting because it contains handwritten comments. An unknown author made notes in the margins about the significance of various provisions of the Manifesto. The style of the comments indicates that they were written by an educated contemporary of the events, possibly a lawyer or statesman. The 19th century brought a new wave of copying the Manifesto. Historians working on the study of the era of Peter III made copies for scientific purposes. These copies often contained attempts to reconstruct the original text based on comparisons of various sources. Nikolai Mikhailovich Karamzin created his own version of the text of the Manifesto for for his history of the Russian state. He compared several copies available to him and attempted to reconstruct the most authentic version. Karamzin's version was long considered the standard. Sergei Mikhailovich Solovyov also worked on reconstructing the text. His version differs slightly from Karamzin's in the details of the wording. Solovyov had access to archives that were unavailable to Karamzin, which allowed him to clarify some points. The 20th century was marked by the appearance of scholarly and critical editions of the Manifesto. Soviet historians conducted a thorough textual study of all known copies. A summary table of discrepancies was created, showing all the different versions of the wording in various sources. The academic edition of 1957, edited by Nikolai Isakovich Pavlenko, was the result of many years of work comparing texts. It indicated all the variants of controversial passages and justified the choice of one or another wording for the main text. Fakes of the Manifesto began to appear as early as the 19th century. The first ones were relatively primitive and easily detected by experts. Fraudsters tried to sell originals to gullible collectors who did not have sufficient knowledge to verify their authenticity. In 1845, an antique dealer was exposed in Moscow for offering the authentic original of Peter III's Manifesto. Expert analysis showed that the document was made on 19th century paper, and the ink did not match the composition of 18th century ink. The fraudster was brought to justice. A particularly sophisticated forgery was created in the 1870s by an unknown forger. He used genuine 18th century paper obtained from some insignificant document of that era. The text was written in ink, whose composition was close to historical samples. The forgery from the 1970s almost fooled the expert commission. Only a detailed study of the handwriting revealed inconsistencies with 18th century calligraphic standards. The forger was unable to accurately reproduce the characteristics of the writing of that time, which gave away the forgery. In the 20th century, forgery techniques improved significantly. Fakes appeared that were made using scientific methods of artificially aging paper and ink. Some of them could fool even experienced experts upon superficial examination. The most famous forgery of the 20th century was created in the 1920s by an emigrant in Paris. A former Russian nobleman produced an original copy of the Manifesto for sale to an American collector. The forgery was so high quality that disputes about its authenticity continued for several years. The Paris forgery was exposed by an analysis of the watermarks on the paper. It turned out that the paper used had been manufactured at a factory that only began operations in 1785, 23 years after the Manifesto was published. This was irrefutable proof of forgery. Modern technology has made it much more difficult to forge historical documents, but it has also made it easier to expose them. Spectral analysis allows the composition of ink and the age of paper to be determined with precision. Radiocarbon dating makes it possible to establish the time of creation of organic materials. Nevertheless, forgeries continue to appear. Offers to sell the found original of the Manifesto regularly pop up on the internet. Most of them are blatant scams designed to take advantage of uninformed buyers. The study of copies and forgeries of the Manifesto has become an important tool for understanding the authentic text. Comparing different versions allows us to identify the most reliable wording and understand how the text changed when it was copied. This work brings researchers closer to understanding what the lost original looked like. Each new discovery of a copy is an event for researchers. Even if it is not the original, any old copy may contain details that are missing from other known versions. Gradually, a more complete picture of the original text of the Manifesto is emerging. The database of all known copies and forgeries of the Manifesto already contains several hundred entries. Each copy is carefully described and analyzed. This work lays the foundation for future research and increases the likelihood of recognizing the authentic original if it is ever found. More than 2.5 centuries later, the search for the original Manifesto of the nobility continues. This mystery has become one of the most enigmatic and enduring in Russian history. Despite the efforts of generations of researchers, the use of the latest technology, and international cooperation, the document remains elusive. The current state of the search is characterized by a mixture of skepticism and hope. Many researchers are inclined to believe that the original was destroyed at one of the turning points in Russian history. Revolutions, wars, fires, any of these factors could have led to the irretrievable loss of the document. Academician Alexander Nikolaevich Sakharov, a leading expert on 18th century history, supports the theory that the Manifesto was deliberately destroyed during the reign of Paul I. In his opinion, the emperor may have ordered the document to be burned as a symbol of his father's liberal delusions, especially in the context of the growing revolutionary threat in Europe. Sakharov bases his theory on an analysis of Paul I's policy toward historical documents. The emperor did indeed carry out a purge of the archives, removing documents that he considered contrary to the principles of autocracy. In this context, the destruction of the Manifesto seems a logical step. Professor Elena Nikolaevna Marasinova, a specialist in the history of the Russian nobility, takes the opposite view. She believes that the document could have been preserved in a private collection and is still somewhere in an unknown archive, or even in the hands of collectors. Marasinova points to numerous cases where documents considered lost were unexpectedly discovered in the most unexpected places. In her opinion, systematic searches in private archives and the use of new technologies could lead to a sensational find. A third group of researchers, led by Doctor of Historical Sciences Dmitry Olegovich Serov, is developing a hypothesis about the possible location of the document outside Russia. Serov believes that the original could have been taken out of the country during the revolutionary upheavals, or even earlier. Serov's version is based on the fact that many Russian documents from the 18th and 19th centuries did indeed end up in foreign archives and private collections. The process of leaking historical materials continued for centuries, especially intensively during turning points in history. The international project Search for Lost Heritage, launched in 2015, brought together historians, archivists, and IT specialists from 20 countries. The project is coordinated by the Russian State Historical Archive and Oxford University. As part of the project, a unified database of all known references to the Manifesto, copies of the document, and related materials has been created. The database is available to researchers around the world and is constantly updated with new information. This allows search efforts to be coordinated and duplication to be avoided. Artificial intelligence is used to analyze large arrays of historical data in search of hidden connections and patterns. Machine learning helps identify patterns in the fate of historical documents and predict the most likely locations of the original. Crowdsourcing remains an important search tool. Thousands of volunteers around the world are studying digitized archival materials, looking for any mention of the Manifesto. In recent years, several previously unknown references to the document have been found in this way. Searches in monastery archives are of particular interest. For centuries, many Russian monasteries served as unofficial repositories for historical documents. In times of political upheaval, particularly valuable materials could be transferred there for safekeeping. A project to study monastery archives has revealed several interesting finds. A fragment of an 18th century document mentioning the Sovereign's Manifesto on Noble Freedom was discovered in the Trinity Sergius Lavra. Unfortunately, only part of the document has survived, and there are no clues as to the fate of the original. Modern technologies allow historical buildings to be studied without destroying them. Ground-penetrating radar and other non-destructive testing methods are used to search for hidden rooms in old palaces and estates where secret archives may be located. In the Gachina Palace, such research revealed several previously unknown voids in the walls and under the floors. The opening of one of them in 2017 revealed the remains of wooden furniture and metal decorations. but no documents were found there. Blockchain technology is used to create an immutable registry of all search operations and their results. Each verified version of a document's location is recorded in the system, which avoids repeated searches in the same places. Quantum computing, although still in its infancy, promises to revolutionize the processing of historical data. Quantum algorithms will be able to analyze the connections between millions of documents and identify hidden patterns that are inaccessible to classical computers. Social networks continue to be a source of unexpected discoveries. Reports regularly appear from people who find documents from the 18th and 19th centuries in their family archives. Most of these discoveries turn out to be unrelated to the Manifesto, but each case is carefully checked. The psychological aspect of the search is no less important than the technological one. Researchers note that prolonged, unsuccessful searches affect motivation and approaches to work. Some historians become skeptical, while others, on the contrary, become even more convinced of the need to continue the search. The philosophical question of the value of the search itself, regardless of its outcome, is becoming increasingly important. The process of studying the fate of the Manifesto led to the discovery of many other historical documents, broadened understanding of the era, and contributed to the development of new research methods. The economic aspect is also important. The search requires significant financial investment in archival research, technological development, and international cooperation. A balance must be struck between investment in the search and other scientific priorities. Legal issues arise with every potential find. If the original is found in a private collection, the complex problem of determining its rightful owner will arise. The Russian state will insist on the return of the document as part of its national heritage. Ethical issues relate to the rights of private collectors and the principles of scientific openness. Should owners of private archives grant researchers access to their collections? How can property rights be reconciled with the interests of science? The educational value of the search cannot be overestimated. The story of the Manifesto's disappearance has become a classic case study for the preservation of historical heritage. Many university courses include this case in their programs on archival science and source studies. The cultural impact of the mystery goes beyond academic science. Novels have been written, documentaries filmed, and internet projects created about the search for the Manifesto. This story has become part of popular culture and continues to attract the attention of the general public. International cooperation in the search for the Manifesto has become a model for solving other problems of lost cultural heritage. The experience of coordinating the efforts of researchers from different countries is being applied in the search for other missing documents and artifacts. Technological innovations developed for the search for the Manifesto are finding application in other areas. Methods for analyzing historical documents, machine learning algorithms, and archive data management systems all have a wide range of applications. The future of the search remains uncertain. New technologies may lead to a breakthrough, but they may also confirm the document's permanent loss. In any case, the search will continue, as it has become not just a scientific task, but a symbol of humanity's quest to understand its past. The unsolved mystery of the Manifesto on the freedom of the nobility remains an open wound in Russian historical science. Each new generation of researchers brings a fresh perspective and new ideas. Perhaps it is among them that someone will be able to solve this 2-century-old mystery and return one of the most important documents in Russian history to its rightful place.